Welcome back. In this video, we're examining the conflict that occurred on the Australian continent during the colonial period, noting that that period extends into the 20th century in some places. For the last 40 years, historians have recognised that war occurred in this period, and that's an uncomfortable realisation for many people. As a result, in this video, I'm dealing with the forms that war on the Australian continent took and the cost it imposed on those involved in it. While I think Henry Reynolds, in the required reading, makes an excellent case that what occurred was war, I still want to consider war in the context of other forms of violence and consider Australia's frontier wars in the context of frontier wars elsewhere in the British Empire. And here's how we're going to do it. We're going to look at 50 years worth of historiography in a moment, and then we're going to place Australia's frontier wars within the context of the British Empire. Having done that, we're going to briskly look at the frontier wars in Australia. And when I say briskly, we're looking at one event and examining it to see that this was war rather than police action or other forms of violence. And then we're following through that idea of the ways in which these wars were waged, perhaps not being immediately recognisable, but arguably being war. We're not pausing to look at individual conflicts, partly because there were so many of them, and partly because I am looking at that big picture context of the British Empire. I'm a little bit sorry about that, but this is something that you can pick up in your research essays if you wish to do so, or even within your posters. While I'm moving quickly here, there are opportunities to explore this topic further within your own work. And speaking of work, we should acknowledge that done by then James Cook University Professor of History, Henry Reynolds. Henry Reynolds is acknowledged as significant in terms of recognising the violence present on the Australian frontier, both recognising that it existed and arguing that it constituted war. These are relatively recent ideas. In his 1968 Boyer Lecture, the Boyer Lectures are annual lectures sponsored by the Australian Broadcasting Commission, and they generally present big and contentious ideas. They often move discussion forward on matters of history and of society. The 1968 one, delivered by an anthropologist, brought attention to work just starting to be done on Australian history and the way that Australia was not the quiet continent in the way that it had been characterised up to that point, but was in fact a site of colonial violence. There's been a bit over 50 years since then, and this is still a contentious point. Henry Reynolds still finds new books to publish about it and continues to be attacked for his views by some commentators. When I first arrived in Australia in the early 21st century, I arrived and was instantly able to observe the Australian history wars in progress. They're no longer quite as active as they were then, but they do bubble up occasionally. People feel passionately about topics to do with frontier violence because it's to do with their own societies and to do with questions of what reparations might be appropriate. And those are issues for settler colonies across the British Empire and in other empires as well, because the frontier wars in Australia are part of a larger history of expansion of empire by violent means. And putting the Australian wars in that context helps to highlight that they were wars. This map gives you a sense of that. The main body of the map shows the British Empire in 1886. That little insert that you can see is the British Empire in 1786. All the regions that are coloured pink on the larger map, but not on the smaller map, have experienced the expansion of the frontier of the British Empire and the expansion of the frontier of the British Empire by violent means. There were wars, frontier wars, in those places. Those wars took a variety of forms, and some were recognised as wars immediately, others were recorded in ways that diminished the quality of resistance met by the British. And the history of war is often confusing. I'm drawing here on the work of New Zealand historian James Belich, who started examining interracial wars within the British Empire, starting in New Zealand, because he's a New Zealand historian, in the 1980s. Belich is useful to think with here because he categorises empire and he makes some useful points about when war occurs. Other historians of empire tend to typify empire as either tight or loose, depending on how much control the imperial centre had in the colonies. Belich added an extra category, false empire. And for him, false empire is where there's been a treaty or the map has been coloured in, but there is no real control on the ground. And when the imperial centre discovers that, it gets a bit embarrassed and then it sends in the troops. And that's an interesting point, because if you look at frontier warfare, generally it's not concluded with a treaty, but started by one. And New Zealand is a nice place to see that happen. The Treaty of Waitangi was signed in 1840. The Northern War followed within a few years, and the wars further south within a few decades. Belich's explanation is that when the British signed treaties, they thought they were gaining tight control over a region, and when that interpretation proved incorrect, they went to war to make the fiction real, rather than face the embarrassment of being shown to be wrong. That idea works in places where treaties were signed, including in the region of Port Phillip, and it may explain why the settlers felt so aggrieved. It also casts interesting light on Reynolds' discussion of the difference between police actions and war. If the treaties were effective, then police action was an appropriate response to illegal actions by subjects, whether they were subjects of British origin or Indigenous subjects. Instead, in Australia, settlers often react in ways that make it look as though they are at war. And this distinction between police action and war, and how we can tell which category events fall into, we'll return to in a moment. Right now, I just want to finish up with the ideas of Belich and how they're useful to us. Belich points out that we need to treat colonial records as unreliable witnesses that contain useful information, but presented in ways that serve colonial purposes. The language used by the colonists is not the best guide to how we should classify events. He's useful to us as well because using his work, we can see that there are connections between events in Australia and events elsewhere. Those connections might be in the ideas that the British brought with them. They might be in the techniques that the British applied in local circumstances, or they might be in who the British were, in the people involved, because administrators shifted between colonies, soldiers travelled between battlefields, and settlers might have connections to family and friends on other frontiers. The frontier wars in Australia did not happen in isolation, and putting them in this larger imperial context helps us this week to start picking them out and calling them wars, and will help us next week when we look at the involvement of Australian colonial governments in wars overseas. But let's get back to Reynolds' distinction between police action and war, and why he feels comfortable in typifying events that occurred in Australia as war rather than police action, despite the names applied. There's an example Reynolds uses in the reading. It gets used by other historians as well. It's early in the frontier wars in Australia, and it's a nice one to pick apart. In the reading, there's mention that in December 1790, the convict servant of Governor Phillip was attacked while on a hunting expedition. He was speared. He did not die immediately. He died some short time later from his wounds. His death definitely resulted from that attack, and Governor Phillip was not happy. This was not the first attack on colonists at Sydney. By December 1790, they'd been there nearly 3 years, and relationships were breaking down as resources were under pressure. It's telling that the people who were attacked were out hunting. Reynolds picks this action apart. The governor sets about dispatching a punitive raid, and it's a pretty horrific punitive raid in the planning. Philip wants 2 members of the offending tribe to be captured, 10 others killed, and their heads brought back to the colony for display. This gets negotiated down by the person who actually has to lead the raid, Watkin Tench. He's willing to negotiate it down to the capture of 6 people, with the understanding that they'll be brought back to the settlement where 2 of them will be hanged and the others sent to Norfolk Island. And if he can't bring in 6 people, then he'll kill them while he's out in the field and decapitate them and bring their heads in. In the end, Tench makes 2 attempts at this plan and manages to kill nobody, but that plan's an interesting one. The gamekeeper and the people with him know who attacked him, but this is not being treated as murder. This is being treated as war, and we can see that in the way that Philip chooses to deal with it. He's not dealing with the attack on his gamekeeper as a murder, as it turns out to be. He's dealing with it as an act of war, rather than seeking out the perpetrator and applying justice to that person as an individual. He's seeking to make a response against the political entity he holds responsible. He wants to attack the tribe, not the person. He's playing this as war, not a crime. And I think Reynolds makes this argument in a convincing manner. It is an odd response to a crime committed by a known person, to respond by sending out a group of soldiers to kill a whole bunch of other people. And this sets the scene for the frontier wars in Australia. This idea of punitive raid becomes ingrained in the Australian colonial psyche, and it is a recognition, Reynolds argues, and I think I'm convinced by him. It's a recognition that this is confrontation between political entities rather than between private persons. It's not the only kind of violence that occurs on the frontier. Last week, I put up an image of the massacre map, and that's easy to find online. Many of the actions on that map are unmistakably not war, because they involve poisoning, they go against the rules of war, and they are personal attacks. It's messy on the frontier, and as Belich might point out, the language helps to make it messy and confusing, and it's difficult to pick our way through. Part of that difficulty arises from the different forces that are involved. At least with those events at the end of 1790, it's soldiers being sent on a punitive raid. Over the long history of the Australian frontier, and that history runs into the 20th century, over that long history, all sorts of people get involved. Soldiers, yes, police forces acting as armies, and private militias. I'll pick up that idea of police forces acting as armies here with the Native Police Corps. On the slide, I've put the definition of a paramilitary organisation because that's often how the Native police are represented. They certainly use the structures, the tools, and the techniques that are usual in military forces. And paramilitary makes that distinction. Is it actually the force of the state, in which case it's military, or is it something that looks like an army and acts like an army, but does not have the relationship with the state that an army has? The Native Police Corps was established in 1837, and over time it was used in a variety of different colonies as they split off. It gets a bit confusing in Australian history because when Sydney's established, all of Eastern Australia is New South Wales, and so is New Zealand. The different colonies separate off at different times. The Native Police Force operated between 1837 and 1904, meaning that places that it operated switched jurisdictions at various times. They were active in Queensland when Queensland was established, and they were terrifying. This is a significant force It included about 200 troops at any time, and I'll come back to that matter of number in a moment. And over the course of its existence, it employed about 800 Indigenous people and about 450 Europeans. And it's in the title, it's the Native Police Corps. These are people who are brought from one region of the continent of Australia to follow government instructions suppressing Aboriginal resistance in another part. And this is where frontier wars get messy. There was no Aboriginal sense of identity at this time. There were local senses of belonging, and there were long-standing conflicts between different groups of Indigenous people as well. It's the same in other regions within the British Empire. Indigenous people can be moved from one place to another within the colony, and for them they're no longer in their country. They're no longer dealing with people that they feel kinship with. I don't want to get bogged down in that idea here because I want to look at something different. This is named a police corps, and it's also in various ways identified as a paramilitary group. But it's equipped by the colonial government, first the government of New South Wales, then the government of Queensland. And the archaeology that is being conducted on Queensland mounted police camps is a big project. There's a link in that list of further references if this is what you want to look into. But there's a lot going on looking into the Queensland Mounted Police and looking at their camps. And what the archaeologists are finding is evidence that they were using Snider rifles. And this is important because in Queensland at that time, Snider rifles came from the colonial government. They weren't in general use by pastoralists or miners. They weren't something that you picked up. They were issued by the government. And the question here, I think, is how do we consider this Native Police Corps, which was used by colonial governments to disperse Aboriginal groups? And disperse is a euphemism. It means kill some, make life so difficult for others that they move out of the area that you're interested in. If we consider that Aboriginal political groups existed at this point, we then need to ask whether the Queensland Mounted Police or the Native Police Force represents the Queensland colonial government. And I think it's that question of whether using subcontractors to fight your war for you manages to reduce your responsibility for the war. And I don't think that that's a reasonable position to take. And this is part of the problem of discussing these wars. There are so many different political entities in terms of different Indigenous political groups, and then the colonial governments confuse the matter further by encouraging settlers to take matters into their own hands and by equipping forces such as this, confusing the matter with the terminology applied to it, and conducting war at one remove. I mentioned that matter of numbers, that 200 is a significant force in this period, and that's the case throughout the British Empire. There are larger battles, there are larger wars, but in the context of the time, that's a significant force. Some of these smaller conflicts are difficult to pick up because there aren't so many people involved, and because the British Empire tended to minimise conflicts where it was losing. Again, this is drawing on Bellich's work. And part of Jamie's work is looking at the excuses that regularly come up when the British lose wars. Because the British can only lose wars, it's not that Indigenous people can win them. Because in British minds, in British imperial minds, wars and battles have to be lost. In their way of thinking, they can't recognise that at times they're beaten fair and square on the battlefield. The image here is a memorial to British sailors killed in the Battle of Kororareka in the north of New Zealand. This is part of the Northern War, that war that Britain lost. Every death is a tragedy, and these deaths mark the loss of a third of the crew of this particular ship. In colonial warfare, in New Zealand as well, deaths can number in the tens or the scores and be significant. And it's a point that's made in the documentation associated with that massacre map as well. That for small groups of hunter-gatherers, The death of 6 people can destroy the group. Some members might survive, but the group as a whole can be destroyed. Its surviving members can be absorbed by neighbouring groups. They might have to come in to the colony in order to continue to survive. And again, colonial wars and colonial wars in Australia are spread out over time, and they're not like the battles of the First World War. They don't kill thousands in one go, but that doesn't mean they're not significant. And the frontier wars certainly affected the lives of people in Australia. The image here gives that sense of what it was like for some colonists in Australia at this time. They lived in fear of their lives, and some of them died. Indigenous groups were under attack as well and had to deal with that violence being meted out by the colonial government. And that image is an interesting one. I've cropped it. I've cropped it for reasons that I'll discuss at the start of the next video. But even in this cropped section, you can see the use of terrifying and sophisticated methods of attack on those settlers. Those are spears carrying flames. And you can see those men in the doorway of the shepherd's hut holding rifles. On the Australian frontier, as I've mentioned, entire groups of Aboriginal people were destroyed. Colonists also died at times and in places, and I don't want to get dragged down into the Australian History Wars accounting of Keith Windshuttle, who wants to tally up deaths and argue about when you can be certain somebody died and when you can't. I'm happy to accept there were deaths on both sides. I'm happy to accept that the wars were terrifying to people on both sides of the frontier. My own interests come through in my thinking about this as well. In Australia, colonists often complain about their livestock being speared and being speared wantonly by Indigenous people. In my view, that's part of this colonial warfare, that those animals are being killed as proxies for settlers and as an attack on their economies. Again, my interests creep in when I notice those men holding rifles. Because of these frontier wars, guns and horses are common throughout the Australian colonies. Horses are an important tool of war. They're what give the native mounted police an advantage over the people that they're terrorising on behalf of the government. Horses are amazing military technology, and they're common throughout Australia, as are guns. And this facilitates other war-adjacent activities. My interest is in hunting and the history of hunting, and hunting is certainly a war-adjacent activity. People who undertake it in the colonial period openly discuss the way in which hunting prepares them for war. Those two things, horses and guns, also facilitate lawlessness on the part of people of British descent. Australia has a proud tradition of bushranging, and bushrangers are able to operate because these tools are available in the Australian colonies. But the records are difficult. After the Mile Creek massacre and the trial which followed, and which resulted in the execution of colonists who had perpetrated the massacre, people became a little less clear about their actions on the frontier. We can use Henry Reynolds and that Gamekeeper's War as a guide to what's going on, though. Are people, Indigenous people, placed on trial? Has the state expanded, and so are matters of violence and resistance to the colonial state matters for the police, or are they still matters for private military action? Is there still acceptance by the government that settlers will act on their own behalf, and the supply of forces such as the native mounted police to assist in that unnamed and informal warfare on the frontier? In tutorial, we can discuss your views on whether a particular series of events qualify as war or not, and how we deal with the records. And it's something that continues to be a problem in Australian popular history. There was violence on the frontier, but how do we characterise it? I'm following Reynolds and characterising a great deal of it as war, and as war within the context of the British Empire. But it is possible to pick out some events and label them differently. Label them as police actions that result in clear administration of justice, and to label them as massacre, closer to genocide than to war.